Imagine you had a favorite takeaway that you went to for years. You love how they cook their food, with its taste and texture so perfect, you could believe it was made specifically for you. Then, one day, they announce that they'll be trying out a new dish, and they'd like you to give it a taste. You take one bite and you needn't take another because you immediately know that this is not how you like your food. In fact, it might be everything you don't like about food. In a similar way, Granblue Fantasy Versus represents everything I don't like in a fighting game.
Engage!
It's much slower and much simpler than the fighting games I've played for years, and the same can be said for a lot of its target audience. The game was developed by Arc System Works, a group that built a reputation and an audience around their fast-paced fighting games. From announcement to release, Arcsys were transparent about Granblue Fantasy Versus being different to their other games. But this game isn't just different. It's the polar opposite of what you'd expect from an Arcsys game. Instead of air dashes, long combos, and a chaotic pace, Versus is deliberately slow, grounded, and footsies based.
Down.
They've even implemented the most restrictive combo system to ever exist in a fighting game. Where other Arcsys fighting games have combos so long they're almost cinematic, Versus completely rejects the idea of long combos. Maybe that's your cup of tea, but I know what I like in my fighting games and it isn't that. So I went into Versus with low expectations. Surprisingly, I came out of it with a match count of over 2,000 and a lot of praise to sing for the game. This game has combo limits, special move cooldowns, a block button, barely any ways to spend meter, and heavily relies on auto combos. This is a recipe for the most boring fighting game ever, cooked up by some Scrooge who hates fighting games. Yet, somehow, it's actually really fun. Upon release, I vividly remember my friend asking, "What's the appeal?" It's a good question because, aside from how beautiful the characters, stages, and supers look, the gameplay's unique appeal won't jump out at you. But that's the point. No particular mechanic here is supposed to scream for your attention. Granblue Fantasy Versus strips fighting games down to their core, and it's able to work because fighting games are great at their core. Just you and your opponent duking it out without having to go through the steps of learning to use and learning to fight against a unique gameplay mechanic. My favorite fighting games all have their own distinct mechanics that add flavor to a match, so it's easy to worry that a fighting game without these extra bits won't be as fun. But it's also easy to forget how those same extra bits can get in the way of what makes fighting games great sometimes. I think Versus deserves some credit for keeping it simple in an era where every fighting game seemingly wants to have some kind of gimmick to make it feel fresh. Versus can't get too much credit though. In their journey back to basics, rather than knowing when to chill out, they took it a bit too far with that combo system. Auto combos are one thing, a thing I honestly don't mind, but the combo limiter will kick in all too quickly the moment you start doing anything fancy. There's a system to what triggers the combo limit, but they don't explain it. Players of the game had to decipher it for themselves, and it's complicated enough that there's not much point in relaying that information to you. The important part is that it forces everyone to use a very similar structure for combos across the cast. EX special move that'll launch them, button into special, and you won't get much more than that before you reach the limit. I don't understand why this had to be here, or why it had to activate so quickly all the time. I would have thought that special moves all having a cooldown would serve as a combo limiter itself, but apparently not. Sure, without a combo limiter, Matera could loop her combos forever, but surely she could have just been adjusted individually instead of the entire cast having to face unnecessary consequences. I'm certain that combo limit wasn't made with her in mind anyway, so I digress. Special move cooldowns were one of the biggest concerns about the game. Even just typing it out, the idea seems ridiculous, like it's the last thing you should ever put inside a fighting game. Versus plays well with the idea, however, and the presence of special move cooldowns actually gave more to the game than it took. This is thanks to EX moves, where you perform enhanced versions of already existing special moves. In every other fighting game, EX moves cost meter, but in Versus, EX moves cost cooldown time. The cooldown time of a special move is often negligible in Versus. By the time a special move has ended, it's probably ready to be used again. There are two instances where the cooldown time becomes significant. Either when performing special moves with simple inputs, which adds a noticeably longer period of cooldown, but not too much, or when you use an EX move, which adds a very lengthy period of cooldown where you are locked out of that particular special move entirely. This consequence of using an EX special move can add a fun layer of decision making to the game. When using them, you'll find yourself deciding whether or not you're okay with temporarily sacrificing that special move in the middle of a match in a gamble to gain the upper hand. It's even fun to take advantage of your opponent suffering those same consequences, because when they've temporarily lost a part of their toolkit, that's yet another moment you can work to take advantage of. The special move cooldowns of Versus enhance the gameplay in these instances, but they're an unfortunate hindrance in a few others. If the cooldowns only ever felt like a consequence of using EX special moves, there would be no issue. However, you'll often find yourself forced to use EX moves without really doing any decision making at all. In other fighting games, you don't necessarily need EX moves. You can absolutely win a match without them. In Versus, you can't do any real combos or even get a knockdown without using the EX version of one or several special moves in a row. Avoiding EX special moves is greatly handicapping yourself in this game, whereas in other fighting games, it's hard to feel handicapped for not using an EX special move at all. Maybe if you're a top 100 player in the country, you'd start to feel it, I guess. In Versus, nobody's putting a gun to your head and telling you to use EX special moves now, but the gameplay is designed in a way that forces you to, meaning that you'll inevitably have these moments in game where you just don't have a critical special move, and there wasn't really anything you could do about that. It won't feel like a fair consequence of decidedly using the more powerful version of an attack. It'll feel like Granblue Fantasy Versus being annoying. It's irritating, but it isn't so intrusive that it ruins the game, but you need to figure out a different way to do it until that special move returns. For this review, I wish I had an attractive character select screen to show off to you, but my character select screen is littered with locks because Versus has more characters as paid DLC than it has in its base roster. The game released with 11 characters. Well, it's 12 if you unlock BAs above through RPG mode, but it currently has 12 DLC characters that you must pay to play. I bought the characters that appealed to me, and none of them were disappointing. Versus is a very controlled and tame fighting game. But even through these conditions, Arxis made every character feel distinct, DLC included. Even the most subtle differences, like the properties of a fireball, make all the difference in-game. Belial and Gran both play the most standard game of Versus, but Belial's ability to spin his fireballs can expand into so many new options that can make him stand out as his own character. And yet, you can still throw it around like a normal fireball, if you want to. And that's just one example. The fireballs of Versus are worthy of an entire video itself. Arxis did some very neat stuff here, without ever letting one individual character go completely off the rails. With DLC characters this well made, I was never hesitant to spend money on buying characters. But Versus asks for your money in a lot more instances than that. Don't just pay for the characters, pay for stages, pay for colors, pay for more cosmetics, pay for a premium battle pass to get even more exclusive cosmetics? And it was limited time? What is all this? This stage is just a nighttime version of a pre-existing stage. Why is it £3.29? At this point, Versus would benefit from adopting a Street Fighter V Champion Edition style upgrade, where you can buy all the additional content in one package at a much cheaper price. There's a lot to love about this game, and it frustrates me to see it partially corrupted by greed. Being able to change how your weapon looks is a fantastic feature. I love mix and matching different weapons with different colors to see what comes out nice. Most of these weapons can be unlocked through playing RPG mode, or alternatively, you can pay for these cosmetics at a very cheap price. Percival has a baseball bat for a weapon. I didn't even know this existed until a friend pointed it out to me. It was during baseball season where I was super invested, so he knew I'd like it, and I immediately went to buy it. But it wasn't on the list of DLC. I also couldn't unlock it in-game. Turns out, I couldn't unlock it at all, because it was part of the premium battle pass that they ran for a limited time while I wasn't playing the game. No baseball bat for me, I guess, even though I was ready to give you my money. That's the kind of greed that sours a great thing sometimes. It's a bit unfortunate because there's so much polish throughout this game. There's unique dialogue for every single matchup in the game.
Fortunately, I don't have time to waste playing with the likes of you.
Strawberry man. This guy looks like he's cool enough for merchandising options.
That armor's totes bad to the bone. You'd make a good action figure.
Bros, what's that got to do with the fight?
Think if we win, dude. Fame, fortune, and Luane Incorporated. Franchising options available.
Believe in victory.
Not only that, the dialogue is different based on who is on player 1 side and who is on player 2 side. This level of effort is nowhere to be seen in literally any other Arc System Works fighting game. Whenever a new character is released in Granblue Fantasy Versus, my friends and I enjoy watching the YouTube videos that show every single intro the character has across the cast. It's seriously fantastic. A bit of the excitement I had for Belial's release was in seeing how he and Matera would interact. How would these two characters, who both exude confidence and sensuality, greet each other on the battlefield? I expected a sinful amount of flirting, but I was caught off guard when I saw their intros. These two hate each other. There's so much vitriol and trash talk, and they can't wait to beat the crap out of the other one. It was a funny surprise. If you're the type to get really invested in the characters, the RPG mode offers a wealth of content too. This isn't just a 3-hour cutscene of story either, there's RPG mechanics, beat 'em up gameplay, and boss battles too. These features are fun to play alone, but Versus lets you conquer them with friends too. Yes, even through online connections. It's a rare moment of a fighting game being enjoyable with friends outside of trying to beat each other up. This is one of the ways they managed to appeal to fans of Granblue Fantasy, which I believe that the creative director of the game, Tetsuya Fukuhara, was trying to convey here. Although fighting games are not limited to competition, I believe that it is important to convey the competitive spirit in a fun way, while highlighting the appealing aspects of the characters in order to maximize the attractiveness of a game through different approaches, he said in an interview with Unreal Engine. It's a lot of words, but the key ones are the attractiveness of a game through different approaches. Fighting games have always had the potential to be more than just the in-game match, but unfortunately, it feels as though the genre is pivoting back to focusing entirely on that and ditching everything else. Several years ago, Arxis had fantastic alternate gameplay modes like Abyss Mode in BlazBlue. Abyss Mode stayed around for 2 iterations of BlazBlue and it was incredibly fun. You could buff up your characters by boosting their speed and their damage, giving them entirely new moves, and you could mix and match the toolset of the entire roster into one little mess of a character. Abyss Mode didn't make it into the final installment of BlazBlue, and I have no idea why. Guilty Gear Xrd's similar MOM mode didn't make it into Guilty Gear Strive, and I have no idea why. Granblue Fantasy Versus puts more effort into their single player content past the typical arcade, time attack and score attack modes, which absolutely shouldn't be cutting it in fighting games anymore. Fukuhara stated in the same interview, "For me personally, this is about the fighting games that I used to play. If I did not feel like playing online against other players, I would default to arcade modes. Arc System Works BlazBlue had a very in-depth single-player mode, and I would play it quite often. It is very enjoyable, and I thought that it would be great if we could add something like that to our title." It seems that, growing up, he had a similar experience to mine. My first 2 tries with the BlazBlue series were both on the PSP, where I couldn't play online even if I wanted to. However, I clocked way more hours on BlazBlue Continuum Shift 2 than any other single-player game on that console because Abyss Mode offered endless hours of enjoyable content. Not everyone wants to play games where you either win or lose, and Fukuhara himself concluded from feedback that many people are averse to playing fighting games because they don't want to lose. I greatly appreciate the effort that they put into RPG mode, while almost every other fighting game released around the same time has a pitiful lack of single-player content. Granblue Fantasy Versus made sure to still give the competitive scene the attention it needs. On top of designing a game that'll satisfy a fighting game veteran, they created a good ranking system as well as staying involved by running in-game events like Blitz. During this 3-day event, Ranked Mode was overhauled with Blitz Mode, where you played for points that granted you new in-game rewards. Cool stuff! But it's hard to sing its praises when it's all undercut by the glaring issue this game has: the lack of rollback netcode. It had to be talked about eventually. Granblue Fantasy Versus released in 2020 with delay-based netcode. This was a time when Arc System Works were still using delay-based netcode across all their games. In fact, not many people remember that Guilty Gear Strive was initially set to release with delay-based netcode until enough dedicated ArcSys fans convinced them otherwise. You guys really saved that game, by the way. Unfortunately, Granblue Fantasy Versus is a victim of being the last fighting game to release right before ArcSys got their head straight about using rollback netcode. Coincidentally, it was released around the same time as the pandemic, when all the locals and tournaments were shutting due to the global lockdown. There was no Evo for the release year of Granblue Fantasy Versus, which I'm sure was especially painful for Cygames. They sponsored Evo the year prior, likely as long-term preparation for Granblue Fantasy Versus to receive the spotlight on the biggest fighting game stage of all. Then, after their fighting game was released, there was no Evo. Even more upsetting, every single Arc System Works fighting game has been updated to include rollback netcode, except Granblue Fantasy Versus. Guilty Gear XX Accent Core, Guilty Gear Xrd, BlazBlue Central Fiction, BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle, Persona 4 Arena, and Dragon Ball FighterZ have all announced or already implemented the replacement of their original delay-based netcode with a new rollback netcode. Granblue Fantasy Versus turned out to be the unlucky sucker, which is a real shame. Arc System Works isn't fully to blame, as Granblue Fantasy Versus actually belongs to Cygames. The players want it, and both companies are aware that they do. Fukuhara said, "We want to add it, but there are circumstances that prevent us from easily changing something that was originally designed for a delay-based system." He's not wrong. It is hard. However, you have no choice but to add it if you want the game to thrive. In 2022, there is no excuse, and he knows it. With the current trend being rollback netcode, and with Strive garnering good reviews, we feel like it's practically become a must-have. Although we may feel that way, we cannot comment on whether or not it will be implemented for Granblue Fantasy Versus. We can only hope that it eventually does get implemented into the game. Granblue Fantasy Versus is a great fighting game. By all means, I shouldn't enjoy it, but it's so well designed that I do anyway. It's a real shame that such enjoyment is frequently limited by subpar delay-based connections that discourage me from going online at all. Granblue Fantasy Versus has notable flaws. It wants too much of my money and the netcode is subpar. Yet, when I do get to play a smooth match, I have nothing but praises to sing because the gameplay, both single and multiplayer, are excellent. Simple but riveting gameplay, a diverse but not overwhelmingly complicated roster, beautiful stages, blood-pumping music, and snazzy in-game cosmetics to boot. It's too sad to watch this game fade because of a subpar online, but they can only blame themselves. They can fix this, we are all waiting for them to do it, because if they do, maybe this game will finally get some of the spotlight that it deserved from the very beginning.